In September of 1944, United States Marines waded ashore on a coral island in the Pacific they were told they could secure in 4 days. It would take them 2.5 months, and the island turned out to be strategically useless. This was the Battle of Peleliu, the Pacific War's most underrated hell, and the reason it nearly broke the Marine Corps. By the autumn of 1944, the island-hopping campaign had pushed the Americans deep into the Western Pacific toward Japan itself. Peleliu sat at the southern end of the Palau Islands, roughly 500 miles east of the Philippines. Admiral William Halsey had argued the Palaus were a waste of ships and men, but the High Command pressed on. The island was roughly 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, about the size of Manhattan. Its only value was an airstrip the Americans wanted to neutralize before the Philippines invasion. But the Japanese commander, Colonel Nakagawa, had no intention of defending the beach. He had studied the defeats at Tarawa and Saipan and learned that beach defenses were suicide against naval bombardment. So Nakagawa built his fortress not on the shore, but in the island's jagged limestone spine called Umurbrogol Mountain. Over the course of a year, his engineers carved more than 500 caves into that ridge and linked them with tunnels. Each cave was a self-contained kill box with interlocking fields of fire, protected by steel doors and thick coral walls. The ridge was so hard that naval shells and bombs bounced off it like it was armor plate. When the Marines landed on September 15th, the beach was eerily quiet. The Japanese had pulled back into the mountain. It was a trap, and within minutes, the silence shattered into the heaviest incoming fire of the entire Pacific campaign. The assault force belonged to the 1st Marine Division, veterans of Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. Their commander, Major General William Rupertus, predicted the island would fall in 4 days. He even refused the offer of a 2nd division to reinforce the assault, so certain was he. The naval bombardment before the landing was the heaviest of the Pacific War to that point. Battleships and cruisers poured thousands of shells onto the island over 3 days. But the Japanese had buried their defenses so deep that much of the bombardment was wasted. When the first waves hit the beaches on the morning of the 15th, they found only scattered resistance. Then the Japanese opened fire from the high ground, catching the Marines in a deadly crossfire. The landing craft that carried the Marines had to cross a coral reef that grounded many of them hundreds of yards out. That meant the men had to wade through deep water under fire, weighed down by full packs and weapons. The Japanese artillery on the ridge had the entire beach and reef zeroed in with pre-measured ranges. Colonel Nakagawa had spent a full year ranging every yard of that shoreline for exactly this moment. Within the first hour, the Marines on the beach were pinned down and taking heavy losses. By nightfall of that first day, more than 1,100 Marines had become casualties. The 4-day plan was already collapsing, and the Marines had barely moved off the beach. The real fight lay ahead, in the jagged, cave-riddled fortress of Umurbrogol Mountain. The fight for that mountain would drag on for weeks, turning into a grinding war of attrition. The Marines had to attack caves one by one, each position requiring its own miniature assault. Flamethrowers became the weapon of choice because bullets could not reach men buried behind steel doors. Engineers used demolition charges and bulldozers to seal cave entrances with tons of rock and coral. But every sealed cave was a gamble because some had hidden rear exits that let the defenders escape. The Japanese defenders were under orders to fight to the last man and to take as many Marines as possible with them. In the first week, the Marines captured the airfield, but the ridge above it remained firmly in Japanese hands. That airfield, the island's only strategic asset, proved almost useless because the ridge dominated it. As the days dragged on, the Marines were reinforced by the Army's 81st Infantry Division. The 1st Marine Division was so worn down that it had to be pulled off the line to recover. In the end, the island was declared secured on the 27th of November, 2.5 months after the landing. Colonel Nakagawa, the architect of the defense, burned his regimental colors and took his own life rather than surrender. Nearly all of the roughly 11,000 Japanese defenders perished on the island. American casualties were nearly 2,000 dead and more than 8,000 wounded or missing. For the 1st Marine Division, that was a higher casualty rate than it suffered in the entire Guadalcanal campaign. And the strategic prize the Marines paid for with so much blood turned out to be of almost no value at all. In the aftermath, the United States military conducted a careful study of what had gone wrong on Peleliu. The official reports concluded that the Japanese defense had been a masterpiece of preparation and discipline. But the deeper lesson was that the old island-hopping assumptions no longer held against such fortifications. American planners had expected the Japanese to defend the beach the way they had on earlier islands. Instead, Nakagawa had abandoned the beach and turned the rugged interior into the main battlefield. This new doctrine of defense in depth would reappear with even greater fury on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The lessons learned on Peleliu directly shaped how the Marines planned those later, even bloodier campaigns. Yet the question that haunted the veterans was whether the island had ever been worth the cost at all. After the war, historians and military analysts argued that the Palau operation was largely unnecessary. The airfield and harbor that justified the invasion were never used for their intended purpose. Even worse, the 2.5 months spent on Peleliu came at a moment of intense strategic urgency. The Philippines campaign, the next major step toward Japan, was already underway and demanded every available division. The 1st Marine Division, exhausted and depleted, could not be spared for the Philippines offensive. So the men who had fought through Peleliu sat out the liberation of the Philippines entirely. That meant the bloodiest division in the Pacific was denied the chance to strike at the enemy's main force. The veterans of Peleliu would carry a bitter question for the rest of their lives. The question of whether Peleliu was worth it would eventually reach the highest levels of the American command. Admiral William Halsey, who had opposed the operation from the start, saw his warnings vindicated by the outcome. The strategic review after the battle concluded the Palaus could have been safely bypassed altogether. One of the harshest verdicts came from the official Army history of the Pacific Campaign. That history judged that the seizure of Peleliu was not necessary to the success of the Philippines operation. Yet for the men who fought there, the debate over strategy meant little compared to what they had endured. The battle's brutality was compounded by the brutal conditions of the island itself, from heat to thirst. Temperatures on the coral rock could climb past 100 degrees, and water was desperately scarce. Heat exhaustion and dehydration claimed as many men as the fighting itself in the early weeks. The coral itself was razor-sharp and shattered underfoot, turning every advance into a painful ordeal. Amphibious tractors were the only machines that could reliably cross the reef to bring supplies ashore. Every shell that hit the ridge sent clouds of coral dust that choked the lungs of the men below. That dust mixed with smoke and powder to create a haze that made the ridge feel like another world. The psychological toll was so severe that the island's name became a byword among the American public. For the Marines who survived, the memory of the ridge would never fully fade from their minds. Their accounts of the battle would later help historians understand the true cost of that remote island. One of the most revealing measures of the battle's cost came from the official casualty reports compiled after the fighting ended. The 1st Marine Division suffered more than 6,000 casualties on the island, about a third of the force committed. For the Japanese garrison of roughly 11,000 defenders, the price was nearly total. Only a few hundred Japanese soldiers were ever captured alive from the entire garrison. The ratio of losses on Peleliu was among the most lopsided of any major amphibious assault in the Pacific. Yet the strategic record shows that the island's capture did little to change the course of the war in the Pacific. The airfield that justified the invasion was captured, but it never served the strategic role planners had imagined. In the decades that followed, military historians increasingly cited Peleliu as the classic example of a questionable operation. Their verdict was that the island could have been neutralized by air and naval power without a ground assault. The debate over Peleliu also forced the American command to rethink how it measured the cost of every future island. Yet the most enduring legacy of Peleliu was not strategic, but tactical and institutional. The techniques of flame, demolitions, and coordinated fire that won the ridge became the standard for cave warfare. Those same methods would be applied and refined on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where the enemy dug in even deeper. In this way, the Hell of Peleliu became a grim classroom for the battles that followed. The veterans who survived carried not only their wounds, but the knowledge of what the new war in the Pacific demanded. And when the next island loomed on the horizon, they knew exactly what kind of fight was waiting for them. The next island in the Pacific campaign would test everything the Marines had learned on that ridge. Iwo Jima lay roughly 700 miles south of Tokyo, a volcanic speck of black sand and sulfur. Its airfields were meant to serve as a landing strip for American bombers returning from raids on Japan. But the Japanese had learned the lesson of Peleliu and fortified Iwo Jima into an even deeper fortress. The Japanese commander on Iwo Jima, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, refused to fight at the beach. Instead, he built a network of tunnels and bunkers designed to blade the invasion force dry. By the time the invasion came, there were more than 11 miles of tunnels carved beneath the island. The black volcanic sand itself became a weapon, too loose for vehicles and too soft for foxholes. Marines climbing Mount Suribachi faced a fortress of interlocking fire that Peleliu had only hinted at. The fight for the island would take more than a month and cost thousands of American lives. Yet even Iwo Jima's cost paled beside what was being prepared for the largest island of all. That island was Okinawa, the last stepping stone on the road to the Japanese home islands. There, the Japanese had assembled a garrison of more than 100,000 men. The battle that followed would become the largest and bloodiest of the entire Pacific War. But before Okinawa, the planners had to reckon with the lessons of Peleliu in one final way. The question of whether any island was worth its blood had changed how the entire war would be fought. The planners who studied Peleliu understood that the old doctrine of frontal assault was no longer sustainable. Every future landing would now be preceded by a far more punishing naval bombardment. Aerial photography and intelligence would be gathered for weeks before a single landing craft approached the beach. The bombardment of Iwo Jima stretched across 74 days, nearly 10 times longer than the one at Peleliu. Yet even that massive bombardment could not destroy the underground fortress the Japanese had built. The lessons of Peleliu were pressed into every officer who would command the next invasion. They learned that flamethrowers and demolitions were the only tools that could root out a determined defender. And they learned that close air support could break a cave position that artillery alone could not reach. These were the hard-won techniques carried from the fireball of Peleliu into the battles that remained. By early 1945, the American High Command had also settled on a new target for the strategic bombing of Japan. That target was Okinawa, an island whose capture would put American forces within striking distance of Japan itself. The invasion force assembled for Okinawa dwarfed anything the Pacific had seen before. More than 500,000 troops, sailors and airmen would take part in the operation. The Japanese garrison then numbered well over 100,000, the largest they would ever field on an island. The stage was now set for the largest and most terrible battle of the entire Pacific War. And the men who stormed those beaches carried with them, in their tactics and their memories, the fireball of Peleliu. On the 1st of April 1945, the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War began on the island of Okinawa. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, chose to fight from fortified positions far inland rather than on the beaches. His plan was a direct inheritance of the defensive philosophy the Japanese had perfected on Peleliu. Ushijima anchored his defense on the southern third of the island, where ridgelines and ravines offered natural fortress walls. Behind those ridges, the Japanese dug a labyrinth of caves and tunnels that dwarfed anything at Peleliu. The northern beaches were deliberately left lightly defended, so the Americans would land almost without resistance. This was the very trap the Marines had fallen into at Peleliu, and now the Japanese had refined it to a science. For the first days, the invasion moved fast, and many officers dared to hope this island would be different. But the real battle began only when the Americans reached the southern ridgelines and the Shuri Line. The Shuri Line was a belt of fortifications running across the island, anchored on ancient castle ruins and steep ridges. Every hill in that line was a separate fortress, and each one had to be taken with flamethrowers and demolitions. The techniques the Marines had bled to learn on Peleliu were now being applied across a much larger battlefield. But Okinawa introduced a new horror that Peleliu had never faced: the massed suicide attacks of the Japanese Air Force. Over the course of the battle, more than 1,400 kamikaze aircraft struck the American fleet. These attacks sank or damaged more than 150 American ships in a single campaign. The kamikaze was not a Peleliu lesson, but a new weapon born of desperation that the Pacific War had not yet seen. By the spring of 1945, the kamikaze had become the defining threat of the Okinawa campaign. The American fleet answered with a new screen of radar picket destroyers ringing the island. These picket ships absorbed the first wave of attacks so the main fleet could survive. On land, the fight for the Shuri line ground forward one ridge and one cave at a time. The mud of the Okinawan rainy season turned every advance into a slow, exhausting slog. Vehicles bogged down, supply lines stretched, and the timetable the planners had set quietly collapsed. The battle that was meant to end in weeks stretched into the longest campaign of the Pacific War. By late May, the Japanese commander realized the Shuri line could no longer be held. Ushijima pulled his remaining forces into the southern tip of the island for a final stand. The American advance now pushed into the last pocket of resistance on the island. On the 22nd of June 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa came to an end. Lieutenant General Ushijima chose to end his own life rather than be taken prisoner. The cost of Okinawa was staggering, with American casualties numbering more than 75,000. Japanese military losses on the island were far greater, numbering well over 100,000. The civilian population of Okinawa suffered terribly as well, caught between two great armies. And every commander who studied Okinawa drew the same grim conclusion about the war ahead. The lessons of Peleliu and Okinawa now weighed directly on the decision that would end the war. Planners looked at the butcher's bill of these island battles and feared what an invasion of Japan itself would cost. American intelligence estimated that an invasion of the home islands could cost 1 million or more Allied casualties. That grim projection helped push the United States toward a weapon that would make the invasion unnecessary. The Manhattan Project had been racing in secret for years, and by the summer of 1945, it was ready. On the 6th of August 1945, a single American bomber dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. The Japanese government, facing the destruction of its cities and the Soviet entry into the war, finally surrendered. On the 2nd of September 1945, the formal surrender was signed aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. World War II in the Pacific had come to an end, and the war as a whole was finally over. But the story of Peleliu did not end with the surrender, because its veterans carried the scar for decades. For years, the battle was overshadowed by the larger campaigns of the Pacific War and largely forgotten. Historians later concluded that the seizure of Peleliu contributed little to the defeat of Japan. The airfield the Marines bled to secure proved largely unnecessary, and the fleet moved on quickly. Yet the sacrifice was not without meaning, because the tactics learned there saved lives on Okinawa. Peleliu became the brutal classroom where the American forces learned to fight the war that was still ahead. The doctrine the Japanese perfected on Peleliu would be refined and repeated at every island to follow. The lessons of the island battles directly shaped the planning for the invasion of Japan itself. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, was built directly on the hard-won knowledge of these campaigns. Every cave, every ridge, every fortified position on Peleliu had taught the planners exactly what awaited them. The invasion of Kyushu alone was projected to require more than 14 divisions of Allied troops. The planners knew from Peleliu that the Japanese defenders would not surrender and would fight to the last position. And every island battle had shown that the cost of taking such positions would be counted in tens of thousands. This is why the decision to use the atomic bomb was made, and why it was seen as the lesser evil. The fireball over Hiroshima was, in a terrible arithmetic, the price paid to avoid a far worse fire. Historians continue to debate that decision, but the numbers that shaped it are not in dispute. The projected cost of invading Japan was the single heaviest weight on that decision. And that projection rested, in no small part, on what the American forces had witnessed at Peleliu. So in the final accounting, the battle that seemed useless had quietly shaped the end of the entire war. The Marines who bled on that coral had no way of knowing their sacrifice would carry that weight. But the record they left behind is now one of the most studied chapters in American military history. And its lessons would echo through every American conflict that followed, from Vietnam to the present day. To understand that legacy, we have to return to the beginning of the battle, to the first hours on the beach. On the morning of September the 15th, the naval bombardment lifted and the first wave of Amtraks hit the reef. The Marines expected a beach like Tarawa, but the Japanese had learned from that earlier disaster. Instead of meeting them on the waterline, the Japanese let the entire first wave come ashore untouched. Then, when the beach was crowded with men and machines, the hidden guns opened fire from the ridges. The bombardment had barely scratched the coral, and the emplaced guns were still fully operational. The Japanese had buried their guns in the coral, protected by layers of steel and concrete that shells could not crack. Within hours, the beachhead was a maelstrom, and the Marines were pinned against the waterline. The first day alone cost the 1st Marine Division more than 1,100 casualties. That single day's toll was among the heaviest the division had ever suffered in a single action. And yet the airfield, the objective that supposedly justified the cost, was still a mile away. The terrain between them was a nightmare of coral outcroppings and Japanese fire lanes that crossed every approach. It took the Marines 3 full days of grinding combat to reach and secure that single airfield. The division commander, General Rupertus, had predicted the whole island would fall in 4 days. That prediction would prove to be off by more than a factor of 10, and the worst was still ahead. Beyond the airfield rose the rocky spine of the island, a fortress called the Umurbrogol that would devour the campaign. The Umurbrogol was not a single hill, but a tangled knot of ridges, gullies, and sheer coral walls. In that maze, the Japanese had carved more than 500 caves, many of them linked by tunnels. Colonel Nakagawa had turned that ridge into a single interlocking fortress with no weak point. Each embrasure was angled so that no single artillery piece could silence it from the front. The Japanese plan was not to hold the island, but to make the Americans bleed for every yard of it. The Americans called it attrition warfare, and it was a doctrine the Marines had never faced before. The old island-hopping tactics of frontal assault simply did not work against a fortress in the rock. So the Marines improvised, pairing riflemen with flamethrowers and demolitions to clear each cave one by one. It was slow, brutal work, measured not in miles, but in the capture of a single cave at a time. The flamethrower became the weapon of the campaign, the only tool that could reach into the deep caves. Yet even a direct flamethrower blast could not always reach the defenders hidden in the deepest chambers. So the Marines turned to naval gunfire and aerial bombs to collapse cave entrances from above. Even a collapsed entrance was no guarantee, because the tunnels often had exits on the far side. The defenders, would simply move through the rock and re-emerge to fight from another position. The caves were so well hidden that tanks and artillery often fired only at empty rock. What the Marines needed most was intelligence, and that would come only at a terrible cost. The critical breakthrough came from a single captured Japanese map found on a fallen officer during the early fighting. That map revealed the entire cave network, every entrance, every tunnel, and every command post laid out in detail. For the first time, the Marines knew exactly where the Japanese were hiding and how to reach them. But even with that intelligence, the fight for the Umurbrogol Ridge would stretch on for more than a month. The 1st Marine Division was being bled white, and its combat effectiveness dropped to a fraction of normal. By early October, the division had suffered so many casualties that it was effectively spent as a fighting force. So the Army's 81st Infantry Division was brought forward to take over the bloodied Marine positions. The relief was a clear admission that the cost of Peleliu had exceeded every estimate the command had made. Even with fresh troops, the ridge remained a fortress that seemed to regenerate its defenders overnight. The Japanese commander, Colonel Nakagawa, refused to surrender and ordered his men to fight to the last. His orders echoed the Imperial Army doctrine that surrender was dishonor and there would be no prisoners taken. American forces answered with a new tactic, sealing the caves with bulldozers and demolitions from above. Engineers poured fuel into the openings and ignited it, turning whole cave systems into furnaces. Every sealed cave meant a few more defenders silenced, but the ridge still held scores of hidden positions. The fighting on the Umurbrogol dragged on into November, long after the island was declared secured. The last organized Japanese resistance was finally crushed on November 27, 1944. What remained was not a battle, but a grim mop-up operation through a smoking, hollowed-out ridge. Colonel Nakagawa had radioed Tokyo that the island could not be held and prepared a final counterattack. On the night of November 24th, he led his surviving men in a desperate banzai charge. The charge was broken by American fire, and Nakagawa ended his own life rather than be taken. 3 days later, the island was at last declared secure, ending 2.5 months of fighting. The cost of that small island was staggering, with more than 2,000 American lives lost. The 1st Marine Division alone suffered close to 6,500 casualties, a third of its entire strength. Meanwhile, the Japanese garrison of nearly 11,000 men was all but annihilated. And here is the bitter irony that still haunts military historians to this day. The airfield that justified the invasion was never needed for the Philippines campaign after all. American aircraft carriers had already taken the airfields that mattered before Peleliu was even taken. Even Admiral Nimitz privately admitted the Palau operation had been a strategic mistake. In later years, the battle was quietly written off by many as a needless sacrifice of American lives. Yet the battle was not without consequence, for it taught the Americans a painful lesson in doctrine. The techniques of cave warfare and combined arms developed here would be used again on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But that is a story for another time, because the Pacific War still had its darkest chapters ahead. The Battle of Peleliu was over, but the price of that victory had shaken the Marine Corps to its core. For the men who survived, the psychological weight of the ridge would follow them for the rest of their lives. Historians would later rank Peleliu among the most costly amphibious assaults in the entire Pacific War. The casualty rate among the first assault battalions was so high that whole companies were effectively destroyed. Yet even as the survivors sailed away, the lessons of Peleliu were already being written into new training doctrine. The new manuals emphasized combined arms, deliberate planning, and the patience that Peleliu had so brutally demanded. The intelligence community, too, was forced to admit that it had badly underestimated the Japanese defenders. The Japanese, for their part, had demonstrated that a determined garrison could stall an entire American division. This was a warning that the Americans took seriously, for the next objective lay much closer to the Japanese home islands. In February of 1945, the lessons of Peleliu were put to the test on a small volcanic island called Iwo Jima. There the Japanese had built an even more elaborate network of tunnels beneath the island's volcanic rock. The techniques perfected on Peleliu, from flamethrowers to cave sealing, were now standard operating procedure. And yet Iwo Jima would cost the Marines even more, proving the doctrine could only shorten the suffering. Then came Okinawa, the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War and the final stepping stone to Japan. There the same cave warfare doctrine would claim more than 12,000 American lives in just 3 months. So the fireball of Peleliu, for all its terrible cost, had forged the very methods that would carry the war to Japan's doorstep. Yet the story of Peleliu does not end with the final flag raised over the ridge. For the families of the fallen, the battle left questions that would take decades to answer. In 1947, the United States officially returned the island to Japanese control, ending its brief occupation. Today, Peleliu is part of the Republic of Palau, an independent nation since 1994. And on that island, the caves and bunkers of Bloody Nose Ridge still stand as they did in 1944. The rusted hulks of landing craft still lie on the reef where they were hit on the first morning. In 2011, a team of divers located the wreck of a Japanese ammunition ship sunk in the lagoon. That wreck, the Teshio Maru, had carried the very ammunition that fed the island's guns. Today, the waters around Peleliu are a protected heritage site, guarding the memory of the dead. Each year, veterans and their descendants return to walk the ridge and pay their respects. A memorial now stands on the island listing the names of the American units that fought there. The 1st Marine Division still holds its annual reunion, keeping the memory of the ridge alive. And in the National Museum of the Marine Corps, Peleliu holds a place of solemn honor. Historians continue to debate whether the island was worth the price paid in American blood. Some argue the island was a necessary diversion, while others call it a tragic waste of lives. But whatever the verdict, the men who fought on that coral ridge will never be forgotten. Yet the debate among historians has never truly settled the question of Peleliu's necessity. The official Marine Corps history acknowledges that the island's value was questioned even before the first wave landed. And in the years after the war, the island's airfield proved far less vital than the planners had assumed. The strategic necessity of the Palau operation has been called into question by successive generations of military scholars. But whatever the strategic verdict, the human cost was recorded with grim precision in the official records. Nearly 2,000 Marines and sailors never left that coral island alive. And more than 8,000 were wounded on the ridge and in the caves of that small island. The 1st Marine Division lost more men in those 2 months than it had in its entire previous campaign. For many veterans, the memories of the ridge never faded, carried quietly for the rest of their lives. And it is their testimony, more than any map or statistic, that keeps the story of Peleliu alive. The fireball of Peleliu reminds us that in war, the price of a mistake is measured in human lives. If you found this overlooked chapter of the Pacific War worth remembering, subscribe and hit the bell for more.